Hey everyone, welcome to the third video of the series. Today is going to be actually our first time coding together on the Visual Basic Editor. We'll focus specifically on the macro recorder function, which is a wonderful way to get started with VBA coding. Let's get started. So the macro recorder function is located under the Developer tab and is activated when we click on this Record Macro button. And what this actually does is that Excel starts recording every action that you do in the workbook and translates it into VBA code. And this is the main reason why I think VBA is very user-friendly for beginners. Because you don't actually need to know how to code to get started. You just need to record the actions that you want to have coded, basically. So let's try this together. We're going to write our first program, and we're going to start by recording it. So the steps are fairly straightforward. We click on Record Macro. You're supposed to give a name here. I would give it a informative name, something that will help us remember what the macro actually does. And now we need to figure out what kind of macro we want to build. Now, let's say we want to, for example, change the size of these subtitles here and here. And imagine you have a lot of subtitles going all the way down, and you don't want to be doing this manually. So we'll build a macro for it. This macro should be called, let's say, increase size. And additionally, you can give it a shortcut key. And you want to be careful here, because you don't want to assign it a shortcut that is already used by Windows. So let's pick Ctrl-Shift-L. Yeah, and most of the time you don't want to touch this option here. You want to store the macro in this workbook. So we'll leave it at that. Now you may want to add some description to the macro to basically specify what it does exactly. And note that any information that you enter here will be visible in the code as comments. Alright, so let's add this description. Let's say this macro increases the size of the subtitles. And let's click on OK. So now let's start recording our macro. So we'll click on the subtitles we want to increase the size of. We'll go to Home, increase the size, go one step down, increase the size again, and go one more step down, increase the size, and do the same until the last one. Alright. Oh, and there's one more. So now we can stop recording. And if you were wondering, I'm using actually Control arrow to move from one subtitle to another. So let's take a look at our code. Let's click on the Visual Basic Editor and see here in the module 1. Let's go through it line by line. So we created a sub with the name increase size. We ended the sub. And then we added some comments. Increase size macro, the description, the shortcut, and then Excel stored the code right after the shortcut. We selected a range, C3, range 3 selects. We changed the font size of the selection to 12, and then we went down one step. Change the selection font size again, went down one step, etc., etc. Now we want to test our macro to see if it's actually working. So we'll go back to the Excel spreadsheet and put all these subtitles back to their original size. The original size was 11, so they're back to the way they were. Now we can actually test our macro. And there are several ways we can approach this situation. And one popular way to do it is to basically insert a box and assign a macro to it. So we'll do it again to show you exactly how it works. I'll delete the box that I created previously. I'll go to Insert, Illustrations, Shapes, and I'll take any shape I want, insert it somewhere here. And now the next step is to assign the macro to it. So we'll right click on it, look up assign macro, and look for our macro. We're looking for the increase size macro. Click on it, click on OK, and before clicking on it, we'll put a label to it. Right click, edit text, and we'll write increase size. Okay. So now if we watch the subtitles and we click on the macro, you can see that the size has just been increased. So after finishing testing the macro, we want to save our progress. And saving our progress is basically saving the file, but there is a small difference to it because we are talking about a macro-enabled file. Let's click on F12. As you can see here, you want to make sure you select Excel macro-enabled workbook, otherwise you won't be able to save it with macros included in it. So we'll save it, and that's about it. Let's now talk about references when it comes to recording. Absolute references will take the immediate and absolute location of the objects we're dealing with. For example, if we're recording and we click on the range A1 and move to range A2, well, Excel will simply record A1 and A2. On the other hand, if we're talking about relative references, well, Excel will always refer to a cell relative to the anchor cell. Let's check, for example, the cell C20. This will be our anchor cell. If we now move one cell down and one cell across, Excel will record that we moved one cell down and one cell across, no matter what the anchor point is. It could be here, or basically anywhere else on the spreadsheet. And by default, Excel records with absolute references. If we go back to our code in the developer section, Visual Basic, this range C3 is an absolute location. Going back to our spreadsheet, if you now want to use relative references, you would have to click on this button here on the top left corner. And if you still don't quite understand the difference between relative references and absolute references, that's perfectly okay. We'll still have plenty of time to explore the concept. And moving on to our last topic of the day, and this will be about comments within the code. Commenting is key for a clear and structured code. Believe me, if you want to get started seriously with VBA, take this habit from now on. Start commenting and documenting every line of code you put in. And the way you do that is by adding a small apostrophe before your comment. I highly recommend to use this, especially when confronted with code you don't seem to understand quite yet. So for example, if I just can't remember how to change the size of the font, I'll just write here a comment and say, this changes the size of the font. And I'll be very happy to come back to it and see what it does. So as we saw, commenting can be a very helpful way to document our code. But it also has a second function. You can also use it as a way to skip part of the code without having to delete it. For example, I want to skip this couple of lines here. Well, I could basically just add an apostrophe here and here. And that's it. And sometimes you can be confronted to very, very big pieces of code, and you don't want to be doing the same thing on every line. In this case, what you do is you go to View, Toolbars, and Customize. In the previous video, we saw how to use these functions and drag and drop them in our toolbar. Well, here is exactly the same thing. We'll just go to the Edit functions, and we'll look for the command block and uncomment block. We'll take those two and put them in our toolbar. Let's say we now want this part of the code back in. Instead of deleting the apostrophes, we'll just select this chunk and use the uncomment block to do so. My personal advice to you would be to never, never, ever delete code. If you don't need something, just comment it out. If you want it back, you'll be able to comment it back in again with this function. All right, that will be it for the third video. In the next one, we'll talk about Excel objects and discuss the hierarchy system within Excel. We'll see how VBA and Excel interact with each other via the object system. We'll talk about the concept of collections. We'll have a look at the object properties and the object methods. And as usual, to test your knowledge, we'll have a small homework assignment for you. Thanks for watching. If you like the content and want more of it, be sure to hit the subscribe button.